The evening sky had turned a deep purple as Captain James Wilson drove along the quiet county road. After 16 hours of work, his eyes burned with fatigue, but satisfaction warmed his chest. His team had finally closed a human trafficking case that had consumed the past 3 months of their lives. All he wanted now was a hot shower in his bed. The headlights of his unmarked sedan cut through the growing darkness. He wasn't in any rush, keeping 5 miles below the speed limit. The small town of Riverdale wasn't his usual route home, but construction had forced him to take this detour. His FBI badge and credentials sat in their leather wallet on the passenger seat, tossed there when he'd stopped for coffee 30 minutes ago. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror caught him by surprise. Wilson checked his speedometer, 42 in a 45 zone. He frowned but eased onto the shoulder, following the routine he'd practiced countless times himself when pulling someone over. Hands visible on the steering wheel, interior lights switched on, calm and collected. 2 officers approached his car, 1 on each side. Something about their posture made the hairs on the back of Wilson's neck stand up. 15 years of FBI work had fine-tuned his instincts. These officers weren't just being cautious. They were wound tight, hands hovering near their weapons. "Evening, officers," Wilson said pleasantly as the window came down. "Did I miss a sign back there or something?" The officer on the driver's side, a stocky man with a crew cut and hard eyes, didn't return the friendly greeting. "License and registration now." "Sure thing," Wilson said, keeping his voice even. "I'm actually FBI. My credentials are right here on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them very slowly, okay?" The officer's partner, taller with a thin face, spoke up. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president." Wilson paused, his hand halfway toward the passenger seat. "I understand your skepticism, but I really am FBI. Captain James Wilson, Northeast Division. I can call my supervisor if—" "Shut up and keep your hands where I can see them," Crewcut snapped, his hand now resting on his holstered gun. Wilson froze, the situation shifting from routine to dangerous in seconds. He'd trained other agents on how to handle tense encounters, always emphasizing clear communication and calm compliance. Now he needed to follow his own advice. "My hands are staying right here," Wilson said. "But my FBI credentials are on the passenger seat. Black leather wallet right there in plain sight." The taller officer shined his flashlight through the passenger window, illuminating the wallet. Rather than acknowledging it, he scoffed. "Step out of the vehicle," Crewcut ordered. "Officer, with all due respect, I haven't been told why I was pulled over. If you could just verify my credentials." The officer's face hardened. "I said get out of the car now or we're going to have a bigger problem." Wilson recognized the dangerous edge in the man's voice. This wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. He nodded slowly. "Okay. I'm opening the door very carefully and stepping out. No sudden movements." As Wilson emerged from the car, standing to his full height of 6'1", he noticed Crewcut's eyes narrow. In his navy suit, even rumpled after a long day, Wilson cut an imposing figure. He kept his movements deliberate and his hands visible. "Would you mind telling me why I was pulled over, officer?" Wilson asked again. Instead of answering, Crewcut suddenly grabbed Wilson's arm, spinning him around and shoving him against the car. The move was unnecessarily rough, forcing the air from Wilson's lungs as his cheek pressed against the cold metal of his car roof. "We got a report of a suspicious vehicle matching this description," the officer said, though Wilson had been driving, a standard black government-issued sedan, practically identical to thousands on the road. "And now we find someone claiming to be FBI? In this neighborhood?" The implication in his tone made Wilson's stomach tighten. He'd encountered this before, the disbelief that someone who looked like him could hold his position. "If you'd just check my credentials," Wilson began. "You people always have some story," the taller officer said, cutting him off. Wilson felt his professional composure threatening to crack. He'd faced down armed suspects and international terrorists without losing his cool, but the casual prejudice hit differently. Still, years of training kept his voice steady. "Officer, my name is Captain James Wilson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My credentials are on the passenger seat. My service weapon is holstered on my right hip. I'm going to remain perfectly still while you verify my identity." Something in his authoritative tone made the officers hesitate, but only for a moment. Then Crewcut noticed the subtle bulge of Wilson's holstered weapon beneath his jacket. "He's armed," he shouted, drawing his gun with alarming speed. Within seconds, Wilson found himself staring down the barrel of a police-issued Glock, the cold circle of metal unwavering in the strobing red and blue lights. "Hands behind your head, do it now!" Wilson complied immediately, his heart pounding but his face betraying nothing. "My weapon is legally carried. I am a federal agent. Please, just check my credentials." "Shut up." The gun inched closer. "Jackson, check him for weapons." The taller officer patted Wilson down roughly, finding and removing his holstered Glock with none of the professional courtesy that should exist between law enforcement officers. Well, the officer called Jackson, said, examining the weapon. "Standard issue FBI sidearm. Either you're telling the truth or you stole this from a real agent." A small crowd had begun to gather across the street. Wilson noticed a few people with phones raised, recording the encounter. Despite the humiliation burning in his chest, he felt a flicker of relief. Witnesses and video evidence would matter later. "Officers, this is becoming a serious situation," Wilson said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority despite his compromised position. "I am requesting that you contact your supervising officer immediately." Crewcut pressed the gun closer. "You don't give the orders here." A young woman called from across the street, her voice carrying in the night air. "Why are you pointing a gun at him? He's not doing anything." More phones appeared, more witnesses. The officers exchanged glances, suddenly aware of their audience. "He's armed and uncooperative," Crewcut called back, though Wilson had been nothing but cooperative. "I've complied with every instruction," Wilson said, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "I've identified myself as FBI and my credentials are in plain sight on the passenger seat of my vehicle." Jackson finally reached through the window and picked up the leather wallet. He flipped it open, and in the glow of the police lights, the FBI shield and ID card were unmistakable. His expression changed, but instead of acknowledging his mistake, he quickly closed the wallet. "We'll need to verify this," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Turn around. You're being detained while we sort this out." Wilson felt cold metal as handcuffs closed around his wrists. The indignity of it, an FBI captain with 15 years of distinguished service being handcuffed on the side of the road, threatened to overwhelm him. But he remembered the faces of the younger agents who looked up to him, who saw in him a path forward in a world that often tried to hold them back. "I understand you're doing your job," Wilson said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "But this is going to have consequences." As they led him toward the patrol car, Wilson held his head high. The growing crowd of witnesses continued recording, their murmurs of disapproval growing louder. Through the anger and humiliation, Wilson's mind was already working, cataloging every violation of procedure, every word spoken. This wasn't just happening to FBI Captain James Wilson anymore. This was happening to a man who had the knowledge, resources, and determination to ensure accountability. As the patrol car door closed behind him, Wilson looked out at his own vehicle, now sitting abandoned on the roadside. The officers hadn't even bothered to close his car door. He watched through the window as Jackson pocketed his FBI credentials rather than returning them to the car, another violation to add to the growing list. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, carrying Wilson away from his vehicle and toward the police station. Despite everything, he felt a strange calm settling over him. These officers had no idea what they'd just done, or who they'd done it to. And as the saying went in the bureau, the bigger the mistake, the harder the fall. The ride to the police station lasted only 12 minutes, but for Wilson, it stretched like hours. The hard plastic of the back seat dug into his thighs, and with his hands cuffed behind him, every bump in the road sent a jolt of discomfort through his shoulders. Neither officer spoke to him during the drive. The car's radio crackled with dispatcher codes and routine calls, the familiar language of law, enforcement that now felt strangely foreign to Wilson from this side of the equation. He used the time to breathe deeply and gather his thoughts. Panic wouldn't help. Anger wouldn't help, at least not yet. What would help was staying calm, observing everything and remembering it all. The Bureau had protocols for situations like this, though they were rarely needed. By now, his team would have noticed his failure to check in after the case wrap-up. Standard procedure would have them tracking his phone and car. The patrol car pulled into the station's lot, a small brick building with a flagpole out front and 3 other cruisers parked outside. Small town, small department. Wilson took note of everything. The station's name, the officers' badge numbers, the time on the dashboard clock reading 9:42 p.m., crew cut, whose name badge read Officer Brennan, came around and roughly pulled Wilson from the back seat. The handcuffs bit into his wrists as he was marched up the short walkway to the station's front doors. "Keep moving," Brennan muttered, shoving Wilson forward unnecessarily. Inside, the station was quiet. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes sat at the dispatch desk. She looked up with mild curiosity as they entered. "Got a guy claiming to be FBI," Officer Jackson announced, tossing Wilson's credentials and wallet onto the desk. "Needs verification." The dispatcher raised an eyebrow but reached for the wallet. Unlike the officers, she immediately opened it and took a long, careful look at the FBI shield and ID card. Her expression changed subtly. "Where'd you pick him up?" she asked, her tone noticeably more professional than the officers. "County Road 16. Suspicious vehicle," Brennan said, though they all knew a standard government sedan was hardly suspicious. "And he was armed," Jackson added, placing Wilson's service weapon on the desk as if it were evidence of wrongdoing. The dispatcher looked from the gun to the credentials, then to Wilson himself. "Did you call this in yet?" "We're about to process him," Brennan said evasively. Wilson caught the dispatcher's eye. "Ma'am, I'd like to make my phone call now. My team will be looking for me." Something in his calm, authoritative tone made an impression. The dispatcher nodded slightly. "Officers, I think we should verify his credentials before processing," she suggested. Brennan's face darkened. "We don't need to be told how to do our jobs, Diane." "Actually," came a new voice from a side doorway, "I think that's exactly what you need." A tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a police lieutenant's uniform stepped into the room. His nameplate read, Lieutenant Harrison. His eyes moved from the officers to Wilson, taking in the handcuffs and the FBI credentials on the desk. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone making it clear he expected a good answer. "Suspicious vehicle stop," Brennan began. "Subject claimed to be FBI but was uncooperative and armed." Wilson kept his face neutral, though inside he was cataloging each lie for later. Lieutenant Harrison picked up the FBI credentials and studied them carefully. His brow furrowed as he looked from the ID to Wilson. "Captain James Wilson?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Wilson replied, maintaining the courtesy that the officers had denied him. Harrison's expression shifted to one of concern. He turned to Brennan and Jackson. "Uncuff him right now." "But Lieutenant, That wasn't a suggestion, Officer Brennan. Uncuff him immediately." Brennan hesitated for a moment before stepping forward with the key. As the handcuffs came off, Wilson resisted the urge to rub his wrists, though they bore red marks from how tightly they'd been secured. "Captain Wilson, I apologize for this situation," Harrison said. "Would you like to come to my office to discuss what happened?" "I would," Wilson said evenly. "And I'd also like to make a phone call. My team will be initiating protocols for a missing agent by..." "No," Harrison nodded. "Of course. Diane, please show Captain Wilson to my office and get him set up with a phone." As Wilson followed the dispatcher down a short hallway, he heard Harrison's voice drop to a harsh whisper behind him. "What the hell were you two thinking?" In the lieutenant's office, Wilson finally allowed himself to sit down. The adrenaline that had been sustaining him was beginning to ebb, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. Diane, the dispatcher, handed him a desk phone. "I'm sorry about what happened," she said quietly. "Those two, they've been trouble before." Wilson nodded in acknowledgement but didn't comment. He wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. He dialed his team leader's number from memory. "Special Agent Chen," answered a tense voice. "Chen, it's Wilson. Captain." The relief in her voice was palpable. "Sir, we've been trying to reach you for over an hour. We were about to send a team to your last known GPS coordinates. I was pulled over and detained by local police in Riverdale," Wilson explained, keeping his voice professional despite everything. "I'm at their station now. The situation is being addressed." There was a pause on the line. Agent Chen was smart enough to read between the lines. "Do you need assistance, sir?" Wilson considered the question. Part of him wanted his team to descend on this small-town station in full FBI gear, to show these officers exactly who they'd messed with. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't how he led. Not at this time, he decided. "But I'd appreciate it if you'd notify Assistant Director Powell about the situation. Tell him I'll call with details once I've spoken with the lieutenant here." "Yes, sir." "Do you need anything else?" "My car is still on County Road 16, and Chen, make sure any response is measured. We don't need an incident." After ending the call, Wilson took a moment to collect himself. The office door opened, and Lieutenant Harrison entered, closing it behind him. "Captain Wilson," he began, taking the seat behind his desk, "I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight. It's inexcusable." Wilson studied the man's face. The apology seemed genuine, but it was just the beginning of what would be needed. "Lieutenant, I need to be clear about something. What your officers did wasn't just unprofessional, it was illegal. They racially profiled me, used excessive force, ignored proper identification procedures, and pointed weapons at a federal officer without cause." Harrison's face grew grim. "I understand the seriousness of the situation. Those officers will face disciplinary action, I assure you." "With all due respect, Lieutenant, this goes beyond internal discipline. There were witnesses. People were recording. And even if there weren't, what happened tonight reveals systemic issues that need addressing." The lieutenant's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "What are you planning to do?" Outside the office, raised voices could be heard. Wilson recognized one of them as Assistant Director Powell's. His superior had obviously decided to come personally, rather than wait for a call. Wilson wasn't surprised. Powell had been his mentor for years. Before Wilson could answer Harrison's question, the office door opened again. Assistant Director Powell, a commanding presence in his suit despite the late hour, stood in the doorway. Behind him, Brennan and Jackson looked significantly less confident than they had earlier. "Captain Wilson," Powell said, relief evident in his voice. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, sir," Wilson answered, standing to greet his boss. "Lieutenant, Harrison and I were just discussing next steps." Powell's eyes narrowed as he took in Wilson's disheveled appearance, the marks on his wrists. "Next steps," he repeated. "Yes, I'd like to hear about those." Harrison rose from his chair. "Assistant Director, I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously. The officers involved, Powell interrupted, illegally detained a federal agent at gunpoint. That's not just a matter for your internal review, Lieutenant." The tension in the room thickened. Wilson cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. "What I want," Wilson said carefully, "is meaningful change, not just punishment." He looked directly at Harrison. "I could push for federal charges. I could have your department tied up in investigations and lawsuits for years, but that's not my goal." Wilson stood straighter, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. "What happened tonight wasn't just about me. It's happening across this country every day, to people who don't have FBI badges to protect them, people who don't have assistant directors showing up to demand answers." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Even Brennan and Jackson, visible through the open door, had stopped their protesting. "Tomorrow morning," Wilson continued, "I'm going to sit down with your entire department. We're going to review exactly what happened step by step, and then we're going to talk about how to make sure it never happens again, not to me, not to anyone." Powell looked at his subordinate, with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're sure about this approach, Captain?" Wilson nodded. He thought about the younger agents who looked up to him, about the community members who had pulled out their phones to record what they recognized as injustice. Change required more than punishment. It required education, awareness, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm sure." Through the office window, Wilson could see more FBI vehicles arriving in the parking lot. His team, coming to support him. Tomorrow would be a long day, but tonight had been long enough. He was ready to go home, to shower away the memory of cold metal against his wrists, to sleep in his own bed. But first, he had something to say to Officers Brennan and Jackson, who now stood awkwardly in the hallway, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Officers," he called, stepping toward the door. "I hope you're ready for tomorrow, because I guarantee it's going to be a day you'll never forget." Morning arrived too quickly. Wilson had managed only 4 hours of sleep before his alarm jolted him awake at 6 a.m. His body ached, partly from the rough handling during his arrest, partly from the tension that had gripped him throughout the ordeal. But as he stood under the hot shower, letting the water wash away some of the fatigue, his mind was already sharp, focused on the day ahead. By 7:30 he was dressed in his best suit, charcoal gray with a subtle blue pinstripe, his FBI badge polished and prominently displayed on his belt. Today wasn't about blending in. Today was about authority, accountability, and change. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his phone buzzed with a text from Assistant Director Powell. "Everything in place. Team will meet you there. Sure you don't want to postpone? You've earned a day off." Wilson smiled slightly at his boss's concern. "Need to do this while it's fresh," he texted back. "See you there." The drive to Riverdale took 40 minutes. This time, Wilson noted every speed limit sign, every turn, retracing the route that had led to last night's confrontation. As he pulled into the police station parking lot, he noticed several vehicles he recognized: Powell's government SUV, Agent Chen's sedan, and the Bureau's mobile media unit van. His team had come prepared. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers milled around, some casting wary glances his way, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. Lieutenant Harrison emerged from his office, looking like he hadn't slept much either. "Captain Wilson," he greeted, extending his hand. "We have the conference room ready as you requested." Wilson shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Has everyone arrived?" "Yes. All officers currently on duty, plus the chief and the town's legal counsel." Harrison lowered his voice. "Officers Brennan and Jackson are here too, though they've been advised not to speak without their union rep present." Wilson nodded. He'd expected as much. "That's fine. This isn't a trial, Lieutenant. It's an opportunity for learning." The conference room fell silent as Wilson entered. At the head of the table sat Chief Raymond Walsh, a heavy-set man in his early 60s with a stern expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Beside him sat a nervous-looking woman in a crisp suit, the town attorney, presumably. Assistant Director Powell and Agent Chen were already seated on one side of the table, along with a man Wilson recognized as the Bureau's legal counsel. On the other side sat several uniformed officers, including Brennan and Jackson, who stared fixedly at the table. At the far end of the room, a young officer was setting up recording equipment. Along the wall, a projector screen had been pulled down, ready to display whatever evidence would be presented. "Good morning," Wilson said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Thank you all for being here. I know this isn't how any of us planned to spend our day." He moved to the head of the table opposite Chief Walsh. "Before we begin, I want to clarify something. I'm not here to destroy careers or file lawsuits. I'm here because what happened last night reveals problems that need addressing. Problems that affect not just how you treated me, but how you might be treating your entire community." Chief Walsh cleared his throat. "Captain Wilson, while we appreciate your restraint in this matter, I want to be clear that our department has protocols in place that were simply not followed last night. This was an isolated incident involving 2 officers who—" "Chief," Wilson interrupted gently but firmly, "if I may, let's start by reviewing exactly what happened before we determine whether this was isolated or indicative of something deeper." Turned to the young officer with the recording equipment. "Officer? Rivera, sir." Officer Thomas Rivera. Officer Rivera, could you please play the dashcam footage from last night? The lights dimmed, and the projector flickered to life. On screen, Wilson's sedan came into view, driving steadily below the speed limit. The patrol car's lights flashed on, though the car had done nothing to warrant being pulled over. The audio crackled to life. Got a suspicious vehicle here. Gonna check it out. What's suspicious about it? Came a dispatcher's voice, a pause. Just doesn't look right for this neighborhood. Wilson glanced around the room as the video continued. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The town attorney was taking rapid notes. The footage showed the entire encounter. Wilson's calm identification of himself as FBI, the officer's immediate hostility, the unnecessary escalation, the gun drawn without provocation. When Officer Brennan's racial comment came through the audio clearly, several people in the room winced. When the video ended, Wilson let the silence hang for a moment. That's the official dashcam footage, he said finally. Now let's look at what the public saw. Officer Rivera queued up the next video, cell phone footage from one of the bystanders. This angle showed even more clearly how Wilson had complied with every instruction, how excessive the officer's force had been, how they had ignored his credentials. By the time the second video ended, the tension in the room was palpable. Chief E. Walsh's face had turned a deep red. The town attorney had stopped writing and was simply staring at the screen in dismay. There are 4 more videos from witnesses, Wilson said quietly. They've all been uploaded to social media. By this afternoon, they'll likely be on national news. He turned to face the entire room. But that's not why I'm here. I'm not interested in public embarrassment or viral videos. I'm here because I believe in the work we all do, keeping communities safe, upholding the law, serving the public, trust. And what happened last night betrayed all of those principles. Officer Brennan finally looked up, his face a mixture of defiance and fear. With all due respect, sir, you don't know what it's like policing these streets. We make split-second decisions. I've made those same decisions for 15 years, Officer Brennan, Wilson replied, his voice level. I've faced armed suspects, entered buildings not knowing if I'd come out alive, made arrests in volatile situations. The difference is, I've never let bias cloud my judgment. Wilson walked slowly around the table as he spoke. Last night you didn't see a fellow law enforcement officer. You didn't even see a citizen deserving of basic respect. You saw a threat based solely on how I looked and what neighborhood I was driving through. He stopped behind Brennan and Jackson. And the worst part? If I hadn't been FBI, if I had just been an ordinary citizen, there would be no dash cam footage to review. There would be no assistant director showing up to demand answers. There would just be my word against yours. The room fell silent again. Even Brennan seemed to have run out of excuses. Chief Walsh cleared his throat. Captain Wilson, I want to assure you that Officers Brennan and Jackson will face appropriate disciplinary action. We can begin the process immediately. That's a start, Chief, Wilson acknowledged, but it's not enough. He returned to the front of the room and pulled up a new slide on the projector, a detailed training plan. With the Bureau's assistance, I'd like to implement a comprehensive training program for your entire department. Bias recognition and prevention, de-escalation techniques, proper identification protocols, community engagement strategies. Wilson looked around the room, meeting each officer's eyes. This isn't punishment. This is an opportunity to be better, for yourselves and for the community you serve. The town attorney leaned over to whisper something to Chief Walsh, who nodded slowly. And if we agree to this training program? The chief asked. What happens to the other aspects of this incident? Wilson exchanged glances with Assistant Director Powell, who gave a slight nod. The Bureau won't pursue departmental action if you implement these changes in good faith, Wilson said. As for Officers Brennan and Jackson specifically, that depends on their willingness to participate meaningfully in the process. For the first time, a flicker of hope crossed Jackson's face. Brennan still looked skeptical, but some of the hostility had left his expression. Why? It was Officer Rivera, who spoke up, surprising everyone. Why are you doing this? After how they treated you, why aren't you pressing charges? Wilson considered the question carefully. The young officer deserved an honest answer. Because punishment without education doesn't create change, he said finally. It just creates resentment. And because I've spent my career trying to build bridges, not burn them, he looked directly at Brennan and Jackson. 20 years ago, I was pulled over just like last night, except I wasn't FBI then. I was a college kid with no power, no badge to protect me. The officer who pulled me over had a choice, to escalate or to recognize his own bias. He chose the latter. He apologized, we talked, and a year later he wrote me a recommendation for the Bureau's training program. Wilson let that sink in. One officer's willingness to change altered the course of my life. Maybe this department's willingness to change can alter someone else's. The mood in the room had shifted. Even Chief Walsh seemed to be considering Wilson's words with new perspective. We'll need to discuss the details, the chief said, his tone noticeably less defensive. Budget considerations, scheduling. Of course, Wilson agreed. Agent Chen will be your liaison for all logistical matters. As the meeting transitioned into practical discussions, Wilson stepped back, letting his team take the lead. He caught Powell's approving nod from across the room. This was just the beginning. The hard work of creating real change would take months, maybe years. But looking around at the officers' faces, seeing thoughtfulness where there had been defensiveness, Wilson felt a cautious optimism. Officer Rivera approached as Wilson poured himself a cup of coffee. "Captain," he said quietly, "what you're doing here, it's not what most people would do in your position." Wilson smiled slightly. "Maybe that's the problem, Officer Rivera. Too many people doing what's expected instead of what's needed." Outside the window, Wilson could see patrol cars coming and going, officers changing shifts, the daily rhythm of a department that protected and served this community. By this time tomorrow, these officers would be national news, this station the focus of public outrage. 3 weeks had passed since the incident. The initial storm of media coverage had blown through Riverdale like a hurricane, news vans parked. Outside the station, reporters shoving microphones in officers' faces, social media ablaze with outrage and calls for firings. Through it all, Wilson had maintained his stance. This wasn't about punishment, but transformation. Now, on a crisp fall morning, he stood before 24 police officers in the community center that had been converted into a temporary training facility. The room was arranged with chairs in a semicircle rather than the traditional classroom rows. Wilson wanted everyone to see each other's faces during these sessions. "Good morning," he began, surveying the group. Some faces looked interested, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. Officer Brennan sat in the back row, arms crossed defensively over his chest. Beside him, Officer Jackson seemed more receptive, though still guarded. At the front, Officer Rivera sat with notebook ready, clearly eager to learn. "Before we dive into today's module on community engagement strategies, I want to share something with you." Wilson clicked his remote, and a photograph appeared on the screen behind him. A young black man in a graduation gown beaming proudly. "This is me 15 years ago, graduating from the FBI Academy. The odds were against me getting there. I grew up in a neighborhood not unlike parts of Riverdale. I had encounters with police that could have derailed my future, but I also had encounters that helped shape it for the better." He clicked again, and the image changed to a group of officers and community members sharing a meal at what appeared to be a neighborhood barbecue. This was taken last year in my home district. Monthly community dinners, hosted jointly by the Bureau and local police. Started small, just a few officers and a handful of residents willing to show up. Now we need the high school gymnasium to fit everyone. Wilson let the image sink in. The officers who attend these dinners report 40% fewer escalated encounters in the field. Residents who attend are 65% more likely to cooperate with investigations, provide witness statements, and report crimes. He clicked to a blank screen. But those are just statistics. What matters more is the human element, the relationships built, the trust established. Officer Brennan shifted in his seat, uncrossing then recrossing his arms. With all due respect, Captain, we're not the FBI. We don't have your resources or manpower, and some folks in this town just don't want to get along with police no matter what we do. Wilson nodded, acknowledging the concern without dismissing it. Fair point, Officer Brennan. Limited resources are a reality for most departments, and yes, some community members may be deeply distrustful of police based on past experiences. That's precisely why this work is so important. He walked to the center of the semicircle. Let me ask you all something. When you joined the force, why did you do it? What was your motivation? The room was quiet for a moment. Then Officer Rivera spoke up. To help people. To make a difference in my community. Another officer, a woman with short gray hair, added, to uphold the law, to keep order. Slowly, more officers began to share their reasons, protecting the vulnerable, following a family tradition of service, seeking purpose and meaning in their work. Wilson listened attentively to each response. Even Brennan eventually offered, wanted to do something that mattered, something with real stakes. Those are all powerful motivations, Wilson said when everyone had spoken. Not one of you said you joined to harass citizens, to create fear, or to exercise power over others. Yet that's how many community members perceive your actions, not because of your intentions, but because of interactions gone wrong. He clicked the remote again, and a new slide appeared. A simple Venn diagram showing two circles labeled police priorities and community needs with a small area of overlap between them. Our goal through these training sessions is to expand this overlap, Wilson explained, pointing to the intersection. The more alignment we create between what you're trying to accomplish and what the community actually needs from you, the easier your job becomes and the safer everyone feels. For the next hour, Wilson guided the officers through scenarios and discussions designed to help them see policing from the community's perspective. The energy in the room gradually shifted, with even the most reluctant officers beginning to engage. By the time they broke for lunch, several small groups had formed, conversations continuing even as they headed for the door. Wilson watched them go, feeling cautiously optimistic. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it was starting. Not bad for a first session, came a voice behind him. Lieutenant Harrison approached, offering a cup of coffee. Some of them are actually listening. Wilson accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. They're good officers, Lieutenant. They just need tools and perspective. Not all of them, Harrison said quietly, glancing toward the door where Brennan had just exited. Some might be too set in their ways. Maybe, Wilson acknowledged, but I've seen more stubborn officers turn around. It takes time. After lunch, Wilson introduced the afternoon speaker, a community leader named Dr. Elaine Thompson, who ran a youth program in one of Riverdale's underserved neighborhoods. As she shared stories of young people's interactions with police, both positive and negative, Wilson watched the officers' reactions. Some nodded in recognition. Others looked uncomfortable with what they were hearing. When Dr. Thompson finished her presentation, she opened the floor for questions. There was an awkward silence until Officer Jackson raised his hand. You mentioned a young man in your program who was stopped by police 17 times in 1 year, he said. No arrests, no charges, just stopped and questioned. How's he supposed to trust us after that? Dr. Thompson considered the question thoughtfully. He probably won't, unless something changes. But the fact that you're asking that question, that you recognize it as a problem, that's where change begins. Jackson nodded slowly. For the first time since the training began, he didn't look defensive. He looked concerned. As the afternoon session continued, Wilson noticed a subtle shift in the room's dynamic. Officers who had been silent earlier were now participating. Several had taken Dr. Thompson aside during breaks to ask follow-up questions or share their own perspectives. At 5 o'clock, as the first day of training concluded, Wilson stood at the door, thanking each officer for their participation. When Brennan approached, Wilson braced himself for a confrontation. Instead, the officer paused. That kid, the one who got stopped 17 times, that shouldn't happen. It wasn't an apology or even an admission of personal fault, but it was something. a crack in the armor of defensiveness he'd worn since the incident. No, it shouldn't, Wilson agreed. And you have the power to ensure it doesn't. Brennan held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and continued out the door. After everyone had left, Wilson sat alone in the empty room, reviewing his notes for tomorrow's session. His phone buzzed with a text from Assistant Director Powell. How'd it go? Progress, Wilson texted back. Slow but real. The truth was, he'd seen this pattern before. Initial resistance, gradual engagement, and eventually, for some, genuine transformation. The key was persistence. Showing up day after day, challenging without condemning, offering new perspectives without dismissing legitimate concerns. As he gathered his materials, there was a knock at the door. Officer Rivera stood in the doorway. Captain Wilson, got a minute? Of course. Wilson gestured to a chair. What's on your mind? Rivera sat, fidgeting slightly with his notebook. I wanted to ask how you did it. Stayed so calm during the incident. Didn't push for Brennan and Jackson to be fired. I've been thinking about it since it happened. Wilson considered the question carefully. It deserved a real answer. I was angry, he admitted. Furious, actually, being treated that way. It cuts deep. But anger alone doesn't fix broken systems. Sometimes, leadership means channeling that anger into something constructive. Is that why you became FBI? To change things from within? Wilson smiled slightly. Partly. I also just love the work, solving puzzles, helping people, serving a purpose bigger than myself. Rivera nodded. I joined the force for similar reasons, but lately I've been wondering if I made the right choice. If the system can really change. It can, Wilson said, meeting the young officer's eyes. But only if good people stay and do the hard work of changing it. As they walked out to the parking lot together, Wilson noticed something he hadn't seen that morning. Community members setting up tables in the park across from the community center. A banner read, Riverdale Community Dinner, all welcome. Officer. Rivera followed his gaze. That's new. Started last week after word got out about your training program. Some community leaders thought it might help. Break down barriers. Wilson smiled. Are you going? Rivera hesitated. Wasn't sure if we'd be welcome, honestly. Only one way to find out, Wilson replied. Together, they crossed the street toward the gathering crowd. As they approached, a few people looked up warily. But then someone recognized Rivera and waved him over. Slowly, tentatively, conversation began. Wilson hung back, watching the natural, awkward, necessary process of a community trying to rebuild trust. This was just one small town, one small department. The problems were systemic, deeply rooted in history and policy. But change had to start somewhere. His phone buzzed again. A call from Powell. How's it really going? His boss asked when he answered. Wilson looked across the park where Rivera was now helping an elderly woman set up folding chairs. In the distance, he spotted another familiar face. Officer Jackson, hesitating at the edge of the gathering. It's a start, Wilson replied. A real start. 6 months had passed since that fateful night when Wilson was pulled over on County Road 16. The seasons had changed, fallen leaves giving way to winter snow and then spring blossoms. And in Riverdale, other things had changed too. Wilson stood at the back of the community center gymnasium, watching as Officer Rivera demonstrated a de-escalation technique to a group of teenagers from the local high school. The young officer moved with confidence, his voice clear as he explained how simple communication strategies could prevent tense situations from turning dangerous. Remember, Rivera told the students, it's not about winning an argument. It's about everyone going home safely at the end of the day. The training program that had begun as a response to Wilson's wrongful detention had evolved into something much broader, a community-wide initiative that brought together police officers, schools, local businesses, and residents of all ages. What had started as mandatory sessions for officers had expanded to include voluntary community workshops, ride-along programs, and youth engagement activities. Not everything had gone smoothly, of course. There had been setbacks and resistance. 3 officers had resigned rather than participate in the training. Community trust was still fragile, rebuilt slowly one interaction at a time, but the changes were real and measurable. Lieutenant Harrison approached, offering Wilson a cup of coffee, a ritual they'd developed during Wilson's frequent visits to Riverdale over the past months. Complaints against officers down 40%, Harrison said without preamble, a hint of pride in his voice. Civilian cooperation up nearly 30. The mayor's office is getting calls from 3 neighboring towns asking how they can implement similar programs. Wilson nodded, watching as the students broke into small groups to practice the techniques Rivera had demonstrated. The numbers are encouraging, but it's the stories I find more meaningful. Like Mrs. Washington actually calling Officer Patterson by his first name at the community dinner last week. Harrison chuckled. Never thought I'd see the day. That woman has hated cops since before I joined the force. People can surprise you when given the chance, Wilson replied. They moved to the hallway as the session wrapped up, students filing out with handshakes and fist bumps for Officer Rivera. Chief Walsh wants to see you before you head back to the city, Harrison said. He's in his office whenever you're ready. Wilson checked his watch. He had a 2-hour drive ahead of him and paperwork waiting at his own desk, but this visit was important. I'll head over now. As he walked the 6 blocks from the community center to the police station, Wilson took in the small changes around town. New signs announcing community programs. The recently renovated park where weekly gatherings now took place. The mural painted by local students on the side of the youth center. None of these changes had happened because of him directly, but the incident had sparked something in Riverdale, a willingness to examine old patterns and try new approaches. At the station, he was greeted with nods of recognition rather than the wary glances of 6 months ago. The dispatcher, Diane, smiled as he entered. Captain Wilson, good to see you. Chief's expecting you. Chief Walsh stood as Wilson entered his office, extending his hand. The older man looked different, somehow less burdened, more energized. Captain, thank you for making the trip. Please sit down. He gestured to a chair. Coffee? I'm good, thanks. Lieutenant Harrison keeps me well supplied. Walsh smiled at that. He thinks highly of you. The whole department does, though some might be too stubborn to say it out loud. Wilson doubted that was universally true, but he appreciated the sentiment. The program's going well. Your officers have put in the work. Most of them, Walsh acknowledged, his expression growing more serious. Which brings me to why I asked to see you today. He slid a folder across the desk. Wilson opened it to find an official letter accepting Officer Brennan's resignation, effective immediately. He's been struggling with the changes, Walsh explained. Showing up late to training sessions, pushing back on new protocols, getting into arguments with community members at events. Yesterday he had another incident, pulled over a young black doctor for suspicious behavior. When the doctor asked for his badge number, Brennan escalated the situation, threatened to arrest him. Wilson felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. Change was never universal, never complete. Fortunately, Walsh continued, Officer Jackson was driving by, recognized what was happening, and stepped in. Defused the situation, sent the doctor on his way with an apology, then reported the whole thing directly to me. Wilson looked up, surprised. Jackson? Walsh nodded, a hint of pride crossing his features. Jackson's become one of our strongest advocates for the new approach. Says the training helped him recognize patterns in his own behavior he'd never noticed before. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. That's actually the main reason I wanted to talk to you. Jackson's requested to become a training officer. Wants to help roll out what we've learned here to other departments. I'm inclined to approve it, but I wanted your input first. Wilson thought back to that night 6 months ago. Jackson's hostile, face in the glow of flashlights, the dismissive way he'd handled Wilson's credentials, the casual prejudice in his remarks. Then he thought of the gradual changes he'd observed. Jackson's thoughtful questions during training sessions, his growing engagement with community members, his willingness to acknowledge past mistakes. "People can change when they choose to," Wilson said finally. "Officer Jackson has made that choice. I think he'd be an excellent training officer precisely because he understands the journey from resistance to acceptance." Walsh nodded, visibly relieved. "That's what I thought, but I wanted your perspective. After everything that happened, well, your opinion carries weight here." As they wrapped up their meeting, Walsh walked Wilson out to the lobby. They were passing the front desk when the door opened and a man in a business suit entered. Wilson recognized him immediately. The Dr. Brennan had pulled over. He tensed, anticipating a confrontation. Instead, the doctor nodded to Walsh. "Chief, I'm here for my appointment with Officer Jackson." "He's expecting you, Dr. Patel. Second door on the right." As the doctor passed, he glanced at Wilson, then did a double take. "You're Captain Wilson, aren't you, from the FBI?" Wilson nodded, extending his hand. "James Wilson. Nice to meet you." "I've heard about what you've been doing here," Dr. Patel said, shaking his hand firmly. "After what happened yesterday, I was ready to file a formal complaint, maybe even a lawsuit. But Officer Jackson called me personally, suggested I come talk about joining the Civilian Oversight Committee instead, said I could help make sure other people don't have the same experience." "We need more community involvement," Wilson agreed, "especially from people who understand the problem firsthand." "That's what Jackson said, that you turned your bad experience into something constructive instead of just punitive." The doctor smiled slightly. "Figured if it worked for an FBI captain, it might work for a small-town doctor too." After Dr. Patel continued down the hallway, Walsh turned to Wilson with a raised eyebrow. 6 months ago, that conversation wouldn't have happened. That doctor would have been filing complaints, not joining committees, and our officers would have been circling the wagons, not reaching out. "Progress," Wilson said simply. Outside, the spring sunshine felt warm on his face as he walked to his car. His phone buzzed with a message from Assistant Director Powell. "How's Riverdale?" Wilson thought about how to respond. He could share the statistics, the policy changes, the new initiatives, but what really mattered were the small moments. Officer Rivera teaching teenagers instead of intimidating them. Jackson stepping in to prevent another incident like his own. Dr. Patel choosing engagement over litigation. "Changing," he texted back. "One conversation at a time." As he drove out of town, Wilson passed the spot on County Road 16 where he'd been pulled over that night. For a moment, he could feel the phantom pressure of handcuffs around his wrists, hear the echo of harsh words and drawn weapons. The memory would always be there, but now there were new memories too, of officers and community members sharing meals together, of genuine questions asked and honestly answered, of people choosing to see each other as human beings first, before any other identity or role. His phone rang through the car's speakers, Agent Chen calling from the office. "Captain, how'd it go in Riverdale?" she asked. "Better than expected," he replied, glancing in the rearview mirror at the town receding behind him. "The program's taking root. We're seeing real change." "Think it will last after you're not directly involved?" It was the question that had been on his mind for months. Change driven by external pressure often evaporated when that pressure was removed. But change that came from within, from people recognizing a better way forward and choosing it for themselves, that could endure. "I do," he said finally. "Not everywhere, not with everyone, but enough to matter. The assistant director wants to know if you'd consider developing a broader version of the training. There's interest from departments across the state." Wilson thought of Jackson, preparing to become a training officer, of Rivera, working with teenagers who might one day become officers themselves, of Chief Walsh, who had moved from defensive resistance to genuine advocacy. "Tell him I'm interested, but with one condition: we bring in some of the Riverdale officers as co-trainers. They've lived this transformation from the inside. Their voices will carry weight that mine can't." As he merged onto the highway heading back to the city, Wilson felt a sense of cautious hope. What had happened to him that night had been wrong, a painful reminder of prejudices that ran deep in American society. But the response to that wrong had created ripples of change that continued to spread outward. One department, one town, One night that could have ended tragically but instead became a catalyst for transformation. It wasn't everything, but it was something real. And in the complex work of creating a more just system, sometimes that was enough to keep going. Back in Riverdale, community members and officers were gathering in the park for their weekly dinner. Among them was Officer Jackson, still learning, still growing, still working to be better than he had been the night he held an FBI captain at gunpoint and forever changed both their lives. But maybe, just maybe a year from now, they'd be a model for something better.